Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out here in the Wild West, ghosts don't always haunt from the grave. Some walk among the living, breathing, watching, waiting. Eloise Harper is one of them. A widow shaped by silence, sharpened by loss. They took everything from her. Now, she's teaching them that grief cuts deeper than any bullet, and vengeance whispers louder than a gunshot. The town of Redemption Gulch was a place that had long forgotten the meaning of its own name. It was a scar on the face of the prairie, a collection of sun-bleached timber buildings held together by dust, desperation, and the quiet, pervasive rot of corruption. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, carried the scent of grime, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of blood spilled long enough ago to have become part of the soil. Justice here wasn't blind. It was bought and sold in the back room of the Golden Spur Saloon and enforced by the man with the deepest pockets and the fastest gun. And for 5 years, the man who had tried to change that was Sheriff Daniel Harper. He had been a different kind of lawman, one who believed the badge on his chest meant something more than a target. He was honest, implacable, and possessed a quiet strength that had, for a brief, hopeful time, pushed back against the encroaching darkness. He was also now dead. The funeral was a stifling, hypocritical affair. The whole town seemed to have gathered in the small, dusty cemetery on the hill, their faces arranged in masks of solemnity. Eloise Harper stood by the freshly dug grave, a slender figure cloaked in the stark, absolute black of a new widow. She was a statue carved from grief, her face pale and still beneath the fine mesh of her veil. She did not weep. Her stillness was more profound, more unsettling, than any wail of sorrow. The townspeople saw it as shock, the fragility of a woman whose world had been shattered. They whispered their pity, their voices like the dry rustle of dead leaves. They saw a porcelain doll, beautiful and broken. They were dangerously mistaken. Standing beside her, a hand hovering solicitously near her elbow, was the new sheriff, Roland Briggs. He had been Daniel's deputy, a man with a ready smile, a comforting word, and eyes that never seemed to match the warmth of his expression. He was the one who had delivered the news, his voice thick with what she now understood to be manufactured grief. It was an ambush, Eloise, he had told her, his gaze full of practiced sympathy. A gold transport heading south. Daniel must have gotten a tip. He rode out alone. They were waiting for him. A dozen of them, at least. Now, by the graveside, he repeated the comforting lies for the benefit of the crowd. Daniel was a hero, Briggs declared, his voice ringing with false sincerity. He died protecting this town, protecting all of us, from the lawlessness that seeks to destroy us. Across the grave, Eloise saw Cole Hargrove. He had been Daniel's best friend since they were boys, practically a brother. They had learned to ride, shoot, and fight together. Cole, a gifted gunslinger with a reckless streak, had always been the wilder of the two. Now, he worked as the head of security for the mining magnate who unofficially owned the town. He stood with his head bowed, his knuckles white where he gripped the brim of his hat. He wouldn't meet her eyes. His grief seemed real enough, but it was tainted with something else, something sour and heavy that clung to him like the stench of guilt. And in the back, leaning against the doorway of the saloon she owned, was Sadie Quinn. Sadie, with her flame-red hair and eyes that saw far too much, was the town's unofficial historian and keeper of secrets. She wasn't watching the casket being lowered into the ground. She was watching Eloise. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, and held none of the pity of the others. It held a question. Eloise knew things they didn't think she could possibly know. Daniel had been a man of habit and meticulous detail. He had also been a man who trusted his wife implicitly. He had never ridden out alone without telling her exactly where he was going and why. The night he died, he told her he was going to meet an informant at the old abandoned silver mill. He wasn't responding to a tip about a gold transport. He was going to receive proof, hard evidence, that would expose the rot at the heart of Redemption Gulch, a network of corruption that implicated the mine, the freight office, and the new sheriff himself. And he had said one more thing, a detail that now echoed in her soul with the chilling finality of a death knell. "Cole is coming with me," he had said, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "He's going to watch my back." But according to the official story, Daniel had ridden out alone. As the first shovelful of dirt hit the pine coffin, the sound was not a thud, but a hollow, empty echo. It was the sound of a lie. In that moment, something within Eloise shifted. The warm, loving woman who had been Daniel Harper's wife receded, and in her place, a cold, crystalline purpose began to form. They had not just killed her husband. They had killed her world. They thought their betrayal was buried with him, safe beneath 6 feet of dirt and a mountain of lies. They had underestimated the quiet woman in black. They saw her grief as a weakness, a shield of fragility they could hide behind. They did not understand that grief, when honed to a fine enough point, becomes a weapon. She would wear her sorrow like a veil, but beneath it, her eyes would be wide open. She would move through their corrupt world as a ghost, silent and unseen, and she would listen to their whispers. She would learn their secrets, their fears, and their sins. And then, one by one, she would make them disappear. The town would whisper of bad luck, of coincidence, of men who simply vanished. They would never look at the grieving widow, the fragile porcelain doll. They would never suspect that the avenging angel of Redemption Gulch was a woman with nothing left to lose. As she turned from the grave, accepting Sheriff Briggs's offered arm, her touch was as light as a feather, and as cold as the vengeance that had just been born in her heart. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Eloise Harper perfected the art of invisibility. She became a creature of quiet routine and sorrowful solitude, a black-clad ghost haunting the edges of Redemption Gulch. Her public performance was flawless. She rarely left the small, neat house she had shared with Daniel, and when she did, it was only for necessities at the general store. Her eyes were always downcast, her movements slow and hesitant, her voice a soft, fragile whisper when she was forced to speak. She was the very model of a grieving widow, a woman so consumed by her loss that the world around her had ceased to exist. This performance was her shield and her most effective weapon. In a town where everyone watched everyone else, a woman who seemed to watch no one was, in turn, watched by none. She was dismissed, pitied, and, most importantly, ignored. And in the spaces created by their inattention, she began to weave her web. Her investigation did not begin with questions, but with listening. The walls of her house, the house of the former sheriff, were a library of her husband's work. Daniel had been a methodical man. He had kept notes, hidden in plain sight, tucked within the pages of books on law and history. They were written in a simple code they had devised together, a playful cipher from their early courtship that had become a tool of his dangerous profession. While the town saw a woman lost in grief, Eloise spent her nights deciphering his final thoughts, his suspicions, his fears. The names began to emerge from the coded pages: Deputy Miller, a man with gambling debts; Jedediah Croft, the freight master whose wagons always seemed to avoid trouble while others were plagued by raids; and Cole Hargrave's name, appearing again and again, circled with a question mark that screamed of Daniel's dawning, agonized disbelief. The name of Roland Briggs was there too, linked to all the others, the hub of a wheel of corruption. The notes confirmed her deepest fears. Daniel hadn't been ambushed by a random gang. He had been led to his death by the very men he was sworn to command, and the friend he had trusted with his life. With the names identified, she moved to the second phase, observation. She would walk to the cemetery on the hill each afternoon, a solitary figure tending to her husband's grave. It was an act of devotion the town could understand. But from that vantage point, she had a clear, unobstructed view of the sheriff's office, the freight depot, and the entrance to the Golden Spur Saloon. She watched the comings and goings, noting who met with whom, observing the subtle exchanges of coin and information. The shifts in allegiance and power now that Daniel was gone and Briggs was in charge. She learned their habits. Deputy Miller, her first target, was a man of weak character and predictable vices. He finished his shift at 6, went directly to the Golden Spur, and played poker until his money was gone, which it usually was by 10. He was a sloppy drunk and a boastful gambler, always trying to impress the table with his imagined importance. He was the weakest link in the chain, and he would be the first to be broken. Eloise's methods were not those of a gunslinger. She had learned to shoot from Daniel, and she was a far better shot than anyone knew, but a gun was loud. It left evidence. It was an instrument of chaos. Her vengeance would be quiet, precise, and cold. She would use the weapons of a woman, the tools that men in this world so often overlooked: patience, knowledge, and subtlety. She recalled the herbs her grandmother, a woman of the old country, had taught her to identify. She knew the ones that could heal and the ones that could harm. A short ride into the foothills, under the guise of picking wildflowers for Daniel's grave, was all it took to find what she needed, a plant the old ones called ghost shade. It was unassuming, with small, pale flowers, but its root, when dried and powdered, contained a poison that was potent, fast-acting, and left almost no trace. It induced a state of paralysis that mimicked a heart seizure, a plausible end for a hard-drinking, overweight man like Deputy Miller. The plan formed, each detail polished to perfection. She knew Miller was perpetually in debt to a card sharp who worked the saloon. She knew he was terrified of Briggs, who held his debts over his head. She needed a delivery system, a way to administer the poison without being anywhere near him. One afternoon, she made a rare visit to the Golden Spur Saloon. It was early, the place was mostly empty, and Sadie Quinn was polishing glasses behind the bar. Sadie's eyebrows shot up in surprise at the sight of the widow Harper crossing her threshold. "Mrs. Harper," Sadie said, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Miss Quinn," Eloise said, her voice soft and sorrowful. "I was hoping for a moment of your time." She played her part beautifully, her hands twisting a black lace handkerchief. "My Daniel, he had some accounts. He was a private man. I found a note. It seems he owed a small sum to one of his deputies, a Mr. Miller. A gambling debt Daniel had covered for him, it seems. I wish to settle it, to clear his name of any obligations." She produced a small, leather-bound book, one of Daniel's, and a few dollars. "I am not comfortable approaching the man myself," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Would it be too much to ask for you to see that he gets this? And this book? It was a favorite of Daniel's. I thought Mr. Miller might appreciate it, as a memento." Sadie looked from the money to the book, then back to Eloise's pale, earnest face. It was a strange request, but plausible. Daniel Harper had been the kind of man to quietly help a subordinate out of a jam, and a grieving widow settling her husband's affairs was a pitiable, understandable sight. "Of course, Mrs. Harper," Sadie said, her professional mask sliding into place. "I'll make sure he gets it tonight." Eloise thanked her profusely and left. What Sadie didn't know, what no one could know, was that the fine, colorless powder of the ghost shade root had been carefully worked into the leather cover of the book. Miller was a man who sweated profusely when he gambled, constantly wiping his hands on his trousers. The poison would be absorbed through his skin, a slow, steady dose throughout his poker game. By the time the final hand was played, the Weaver of Silence would be at home, behind her curtains, watching the lights of the town, and waiting for one of them to be extinguished. The Golden Spur Saloon was Deputy Miller's sanctuary and his personal hell. It was where he could escape the gnawing inadequacy he felt in his role as a lawman, a role for which he was entirely unsuited. He wasn't brave, he wasn't smart, but he was good at taking orders, which was why Roland Briggs kept him around. In the saloon, surrounded by the haze of smoke and the clatter of poker chips, he could pretend he was a man of importance. That night, his luck was in. For the first time in months, the cards were falling his way. He was up nearly $30, a small fortune that would keep Briggs off his back for another week. He was on his third whiskey, the cheap liquor warming his belly and loosening his tongue. Sadie Quinn approached the table during a lull in the game. "Miller," she said, her voice cutting through his whiskey-fueled haze, "this is for you." She placed the small stack of dollars and the leather-bound book on the table beside him. Miller looked at it, confused. "The widow Harper dropped it off," Sadie explained, her face unreadable. "Said the sheriff had covered a debt for you. She wanted to make it right. The book's a keepsake." A hot flush of shame and surprise washed over Miller. He remembered the debt, a stupid, desperate loss from a few months back that he'd begged the former sheriff to help him with. Daniel Harper had given him the money with a look of stern disappointment that had been worse than any lecture. And now, his ghost was paying the debt again through his black-clad wife. The other players at the table looked at him with a no, grudging respect. It bolstered his fragile ego. "Well, I'll be," he said, trying to sound nonchalant as he pocketed the money. He picked up the book, running a thumb over the worn leather cover. It was a collection of poems, something a man like Daniel Harper would read. It felt important, a connection to a man he had both feared and admired, a man he had helped betray. He placed the book on the table next to his chips, a morbid good luck charm. The game continued. Miller sweated under the heat of the saloon lamps, his palms slick. He wiped them on his trousers, then picked up his cards, his thumb brushing against the book's cover. He took another drink, his fingers tracing the embossed title. He dealt the next hand, his damp skin making continuous, and noticed contact with the fine, toxic powder. Eloise sat in her darkened parlor, the window cracked just enough to hear the sounds of the town. She wasn't nervous. The cold, crystalline core of her resolve was absolute. She felt a profound and unsettling detachment, as if she were watching a play unfold, a drama of which she was the author. She methodically cleaned the small mortar and pestle she had used to grind the root, her movements precise and unhurried. She was erasing every trace, not just of the poison, but of the woman she used to be. The memory of Daniel, the kind, honorable man who had despised killing, flickered in her mind. "What would he think of you now, Eloise?" The question was a whisper of her former self, a ghost she refused to acknowledge. Around 11 o'clock, the familiar sounds of the saloon's tinny piano, the shouts of the gamblers were interrupted by a different sound. A sudden commotion. A man's voice, raised in alarm. The scraping of a chair. Eloise stood and moved to the window, peering through the lace curtains. She saw the swinging doors of the Golden Spur burst open. Two men were helping a third, a large, heavy figure who was stumbling and gasping for air. It was Deputy Miller. He clutched at his chest, his face a pasty, dewy gray in the moonlight. They helped him across the street to the doctor's office. He collapsed on the porch before they could get the door open. A small crowd gathered, their voices a low, curious murmur that drifted up the street to Eloise's window. She watched for another 20 minutes. She saw the doctor come out and shake his head. She saw Sheriff Briggs arrive, his face a mask of official concern. He spoke with the doctor, then with the men who had been at the poker table. Finally, she saw two men carry Miller's limp body away. The town's verdict, delivered by the doctor and confirmed by the sheriff, was swift and predictable. A heart seizure, brought on by too much whiskey, too many cheap cigars, and the excitement of a winning streak. It was a sad but unsurprising end for a man like Miller. A cautionary tale. No one questioned it. No one except Sadie Quinn. After the body had been removed and the crowd had dispersed, Sadie stood in the doorway of her saloon, a thoughtful frown on her face. She looked down the empty street, her gaze lingering on the doctor's office, then drifting up the hill to the small, dark house where the widow Harper lived. She remembered the strange request, the money, the book. Miller had been a mess, but he wasn't that old. And he had been winning. Men like Miller didn't die of excitement when they were winning. It was the one time they felt truly alive. She went back inside and over to the poker table. Miller's chips had been collected, his winnings pocketed by the house to cover his outstanding tab. But the book was still there. Sadie picked it up. She ran her fingers over the leather cover. It felt slightly gritty, covered in a fine, almost imperceptible dust. She held it to the light, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was just a book. Still, a seed of suspicion had been planted. It was a wild, improbable thought, a notion so outlandish she almost dismissed it as a fantasy born of too many dime novels. But Sadie Quinn had built her business on her ability to read people and situations, to see the hidden currents beneath the surface of things. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something in Redemption Gulch was terribly wrong. The first debt of the betrayal had been paid in full, and she had a dreadful feeling she had just unknowingly collected it for the executioner. With Deputy Miller gone, a small but crucial cog in Roland Briggs's machine was broken. His death was an inconvenience, a loose end that Briggs quickly tied up by appointing a new, even more pliable deputy. To the town, Miller's demise was a 9-day wonder, a topic of morbid gossip that soon faded. But for Eloise, it was proof of concept. Her methods worked. Her invisibility was absolute. She had drawn first blood, and no one was even aware a battle had begun. Her next target was Cole Hargrove. This was different. Miller had been a tool, a weak man whose betrayal was born of cowardice. Cole was a brother to Daniel. His betrayal was a deeper, more personal wound, and his punishment, she decided, must befit the crime. A quick, painless death by poison was too merciful. Cole's soul was already a battlefield of guilt and greed. Eloise would not be his executioner, not at first. She would be the ghost that haunted him, the whisper that would drive him to his own destruction. Cole was not thriving in the new order. Outwardly, he had everything he wanted. He had a position of power as the mining company's top enforcer, a pocket full of money, and the grudging respect that came with being a feared gunman. But the spoils of his treachery tasted like ash in his mouth. He drank more heavily than ever. His laughter in the saloon was too loud, his bravado too forced. He was a man trying to outrun his own shadow, and it was gaining on him. Eloise began her campaign subtly. She orchestrated accidental encounters, timing her rare trips to the general store to coincide with his. The first time, he saw her from across the street, and quickly ducked into an alleyway to avoid her. She pretended not to notice. The second time, she was leaving the store as he was entering. They came face to face on the boardwalk. "Cole," she said, her voice a soft, sorrowful whisper. He froze, his face paling beneath his tan. "Eloise, Mrs. Harper," he stammered, his eyes darting everywhere but at her face. "I was sorry to hear about Daniel." The lie was so bald, so pathetic, that it was almost laughable. "Thank you, Cole," she said, her gaze steady beneath her veil. "I know you two were close. He spoke of you often, right up to the end." She let that last phrase hang in the air. She saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles around his jaw. He thought she meant Daniel had spoken of him fondly. She meant that Daniel had spoken his name, trusted him, on the very night Cole had sent him to his death. "He always said you were the only man he'd trust to watch his back," she continued, her voice filled with a perfect, heartbreaking sincerity. "It's a comfort to know he had a friend like you." Every word was a small, sharp dagger, dipped in the poison of his own guilt. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, mumbled an excuse, and practically fled down the street. Her next move was to prey on his superstitions. Cole, like many men who lived by violence, was a deeply superstitious man. He believed in omens, in luck, in ghosts. Eloise began to leave small, anonymous tokens, things only he would understand. One morning, he found a single, perfect eagle feather kind he and Daniel used to collect as boys laying on the doorstep of his room at the boarding house. Another time, she paid a young boy a penny to whistle a few bars of an old folk song, a tune Daniel used to play on his harmonica, just as Cole was passing by. She was a phantom, leaving her fingerprints on his world. He started to see signs everywhere. A shadow in a doorway, a familiar-looking horse tied up outside the saloon, the scent of the cherry pipe tobacco Daniel used to smoke. His nerves began to fray. He became jumpy, irritable. His drinking worsened. He started talking to himself, arguing with a ghost that only he could see. His deterioration did not go unnoticed. Roland Briggs, a man who valued control above all else, saw Cole's instability as a liability. "What's wrong with you, Hargrove?" Briggs demanded one evening, cornering Cole in the back room of the saloon. "You're walking around like you've seen a spook. You're drinking too much. You're getting sloppy." "I'm fine," Cole snarled, his bravado thin. "No, you're not," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're a loose cannon. And loose cannons have a way of going off at the wrong time. Whatever demons you're wrestling with, you either bury them or I'll bury you with them. Understood?" The threat only amplified Cole's paranoia. He was trapped between the ghost of his dead friend and the cold-blooded pragmatism of his new master. The final act of Eloise's psychological torture was the most direct. She knew from Daniel's notes that the place he was supposed to meet the informant, the place he was ambushed, was the old abandoned silver mill just outside of town. It was a place of ghosts, a skeletal ruin against the skyline. She waited for a night with a full moon. She took one of Daniel's old flannel shirts, one she had deliberately not washed, and rode out to the mill. The place was eerie, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows through the holes in the roof. She hung the shirt on a splintered timber beam inside the main building, positioned so it would be visible from the doorway, a lonely, scarecrow-like figure in the gloom. Then she returned to town and went to the Golden Spur. It was late, and Cole was in his usual spot at the end of the bar, staring into a glass of whiskey. She sent the bartender over with a message, written on a small piece of paper. "He's waiting for you at the old mill." The bartender, a man who followed orders for coin and asked no questions, delivered the note. Cole read it, his face draining of all color. He looked around the saloon wildly, his eyes wide with terror. Who could have sent it? Who knew? His mind, already poisoned by guilt and fear, jumped to the only possible conclusion. It was a message from the grave. He stumbled out of the saloon, saddled his horse with trembling hands, and rode like a madman out of town, towards the mill. Eloise, watching from the darkness of an alleyway, knew he had taken the bait. She did not follow. She didn't need to. She had wound him up, pointed him towards the cliff, and now all she had to do was wait for him to jump. The ghost's grasp had become a death grip, and Cole Hargrove was riding to meet his own damnation. While Cole Hargrove galloped towards his self-made apocalypse, Eloise turned her attention to her next target, Jedediah Croft, the freight master. Croft was a different breed from the others. He wasn't a weakling like Miller or a haunted soul like Cole. He was a shrewd, patient, and greedy man. His betrayal wasn't born of fear or misplaced loyalty. It was a simple business transaction. Briggs had offered him a monopoly on all the freight moving in and out of Redemption Gulch, a deal that would make him a rich man. The price for this exclusive contract was Daniel Harper's life. Croft had paid it without a second thought. Croft was the logistical heart of Briggs's operation. He used his freight wagons to move stolen gold, launder money, and smuggle guns. He was careful, meticulous, and he kept detailed records, a habit from his years as an army quartermaster. Eloise knew from Daniel's notes that Croft's ledgers were the key, the physical proof of the entire conspiracy. Destroying Croft was not enough. She had to destroy his records and use his own system against him. His freight office was a small, sturdy brick building next to the town's livery stable. It was his fortress, with barred windows and a heavy oak door that was always locked. Croft himself was a creature of rigid habit. He arrived at his office at 7 in the morning, took his lunch at the diner at precisely noon, and locked up at 5 in the evening, after which he would walk to the bank and then to the saloon for exactly 2 beers before retiring to his room at the hotel. He was a man who believed in order and predictability. Eloise would use that order to create chaos. Her plan for Croft required a different kind of poison, knowledge. She needed to get inside his office. A direct break-in was too risky. Instead, she used her status as the town's most pitiable figure. She went to see him one afternoon, dressed in her usual black, her face a mask of helpless sorrow. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice soft and trembling. "I apologize for the intrusion. I am trying to settle my husband's estate. It is so complicated." She produced a stack of papers, old shipping manifests, and receipts she had found in Daniel's desk. "My Daniel had some business with you, shipping some equipment for the sheriff's office. I cannot make sense of these records. I was hoping you might be able to help me." Croft was an impatient man, but he was also a man keenly aware of public perception. To turn away the grieving widow of the heroic former sheriff would be a black mark on his reputation. With a sigh of thinly veiled annoyance, he unlocked his door and ushered her in. "Let's see them, Mrs. Harper," he said gruffly. The office was exactly as she had imagined, neat, orderly, with stacks of ledgers and papers arranged in perfect, obsessive piles. While Croft grumpily examined the manifests she had brought, Eloise's eyes were busy. She scanned the room, her mind a camera, recording every detail, the location of the safe behind a map on the wall, the specific brand of lock on the door, the way the floorboards creaked near the window. But most importantly, she saw his key ring, hanging on a hook by the door. On it were 2 identical-looking keys. One was for the front door. The other, she surmised, was for the safe. She feigned a moment of dizziness, a common trick but effective when played with conviction. "Oh my," she whispered, swaying and placing a hand on her forehead. "The heat, I do apologize." Croft, startled and annoyed, got up to fetch her a glass of water from the bucket in the corner. It was all the time she needed. Her hands, moving with a speed that would have shocked him, went to the small pouch she carried. In it was a small lump of soft wax. In the 2 seconds his back was turned, she pressed the wax firmly against the head of the safe key, creating a perfect impression. By the time he returned with the water, she was recovering, and the wax was safely hidden away again. She left a few minutes later, profusely thanking him for his help. That night, using the wax impression and a set of fine metal files she had ordered from a catalog weeks ago. She began the painstaking process of creating a duplicate key. It took her 3 nights of silent, meticulous work, filing and testing, until she had a perfect copy. Her second target within the freight operation was a man named Silas, one of Croft's drivers, a brutish, simple-minded man who handled the illicit shipments. Eloise had observed that Silas had a weakness for the soiled doves at the saloon, particularly one named Clementine. Eloise made another visit to the Golden Spur, this time seeking out the girl. She didn't use threats or bribes. She used sympathy. She spoke to Clementine as a fellow woman in a world run by cruel men, and she gave her a small, valuable gift, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. In return, she asked for a simple favor, to ensure that Silas drank from a special bottle of whiskey the next time he came to see her. A bottle Eloise provided. The whiskey was laced with a powerful but non-lethal sedative. The night Eloise chose to act, the pieces fell into place perfectly. Silas, after a long haul, went to see Clementine and was soon snoring in a drugged stupor. With Croft's most trusted driver out of commission, the freight yard would be less guarded. Under the cover of a moonless night, Eloise, dressed in dark trousers and a dark shirt, her hair tucked under a cap, became a shadow. She used her new key to enter Croft's office. The lock turned with a soft, satisfying click. Inside, the silence was absolute. She moved directly to the safe. The second key worked just as perfectly. The heavy door swung open, revealing the heart of the conspiracy, Croft's ledgers. She didn't steal them. That would raise the alarm too quickly. Instead, she took the most recent one and a pen from Croft's desk. In the back pages, she began to write, her handwriting a flawless imitation of Croft's own meticulous script. She fabricated a series of new entries, detailing a secret side deal. This new narrative showed Croft systematically cheating Roland Briggs, siphoning off a significant portion of the profits from their smuggling operation and hiding the money in a personal, off-the-books account. She created a fiction of betrayal within a framework of fact, a lie so plausible it would be instantly believed. After altering the ledger, she moved on to the next phase. She went to the freight yard, to the wagon Silas was supposed to take out the next morning. It was loaded with mining equipment, but Eloise knew from Daniel's notes that it had a false bottom where the guns were hidden. She opened the hidden compartment and removed a single crate of new rifles. Her final destination was a narrow, winding canyon road a few miles out of town, the main route for all of Croft's wagons. She knew this road intimately. She and Daniel had often picnicked in the high meadows above it. She knew its weak points. Working silently and efficiently, she used a crowbar and a pickaxe to dislodge a series of key rocks from the canyon wall, creating a precarious and stable rock face. She then took the crate of rifles and tucked it into a small alcove at the base of the weakened cliff, partially concealing it with brush. It was bait. As dawn approached, she was back in her house. The forged ledger returned to the safe, the office locked as if it had never been disturbed. She had planted a seed of suspicion and set a deadly trap. Jedediah Croft, the man of order and routine, was about to have his predictable world blown apart. And Sheriff Briggs, upon discovering the theft of his guns and the betrayal of his partner, would be the one to light the fuse. The echo of a falling rock was all it would take to bring the canyon and Croft's life crashing down. Cole Hargrove rode into the ruins of the old silver mill like a man possessed. The moonlight painted the skeletal structures in shades of silver and black, and the wind moaned through the empty window frames like the voices of the damned. His mind, already a maelstrom of whiskey, paranoia, and guilt, was primed for terror. When he saw a faint, man-shaped silhouette of Daniel's old flannel shirt hanging in the gloom, his nerve broke completely. It wasn't a ghost. His rational mind, what was left of it, knew that, but his soul screamed otherwise. It was a judgment, a sign. Daniel was here. He was watching. He fled the mill, his horse's hooves striking sparks on the rocky ground. He didn't ride back to Redemption Gulch. He rode hard and fast, with no destination in mind, trying to outrun a memory that was fused to his very bones. By morning, he was miles away, his horse lathered and spent, his body trembling with exhaustion and withdrawal. He found himself at a small, isolated trading post, where he traded his horse for a bottle of cheap whiskey and a seat in a dark corner. He had run, but he hadn't escaped. The ghost was still with him, sitting right beside him, its cold presence more real than the grimy men playing cards a few feet away. Back in Redemption Gulch, his disappearance was noted with a shrug. Men like Cole Hargrove often vanished. Maybe he'd gotten into a card game and been shot. Maybe he'd just ridden off. Roland Briggs was annoyed at the loss of a capable gunman, but he was also relieved. Cole had become a liability, a walking, talking bundle of guilt that could have implicated them all. His sudden absence was a problem that had solved itself. The same morning, Jedediah Croft began his day with his usual clockwork precision. He unlocked his office, started his paperwork, and dispatched his drivers. Or, he tried to. His main driver, Silas, was nowhere to be found. A furious Croft found him hours later, still groggy and disoriented in Clementine's room at the saloon, with a splitting headache and no memory of the past 12 hours. Annoyed but undeterred, Croft assigned another driver to the mining equipment shipment. It was a crucial delivery, and it was already hours behind schedule. The day progressed, and the seed of doubt Eloise had planted began to sprout. A message arrived for Sheriff Briggs from one of his contacts at the Army Depot, asking about the delivery of the rifles that was supposed to have been on that morning's wagon. Briggs, confused and suddenly wary, went to see Croft. "What's this about a rifle shipment?" Briggs demanded, striding into the freight office. "That wasn't supposed to move until next week." "I don't know what you're talking about," Croft said, his face a mask of genuine confusion. "The wagon that went out this morning had mining drills, nothing more." A cold knot of suspicion tightened in Briggs's stomach. "Let me see your ledger," he commanded. Croft, confident in his perfect records, opened the safe and handed the book to Briggs. The sheriff flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the neat columns of figures. And then he found it. The section Eloise had so carefully fabricated. His face darkened as he read the entries detailing the secret rifle shipment, the diverted payments, the personal account. It was all there, in Croft's own meticulous handwriting. "You've been cheating me, Jedediah," Briggs said, his voice dangerously soft. "Skimming off the top. Running your own deals behind my back." "That's insane," Croft sputtered, snatching the ledger and looking at the pages. His eyes widened in horror. The entries were there, clear as day, written in his own hand. But he had never written them. It was impossible. This is a forgery. Someone is trying to frame me. "It's your book, your safe, and your handwriting," Briggs said, his voice like ice. "It looks to me like you got greedy. You thought you could play me for a fool." Before Croft could protest further, a breathless deputy burst in. "Sheriff, there's been a rock slide out on the canyon road. It's hit the freight wagon." The two men exchanged a look, their argument forgotten in the face of this new crisis. They rode out immediately, arriving at a scene of chaos. The freight wagon was smashed, its cargo of mining equipment scattered across the road. The driver was alive but shaken, nursing a broken arm. And at the base of the rock slide, partially visible beneath the rubble, was a splintered wooden crate. Spilling from it were several brand-new Army rifles. It was the final, damning piece of evidence. The stolen guns, the secret shipment, the forged ledger, it all painted a perfect picture of Croft's betrayal. Briggs turned to Croft, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury. "You lying, cheating son of a bitch," he snarled. "You were trying to run the guns yourself and make it look like an accident." "No, Roland, listen to me," Croft pleaded, his composure finally shattering. "It's a setup. Can't you see? Someone is playing us against each other." But Briggs was beyond reason. He had been betrayed, his authority challenged. He drew his pistol. "The only one playing games here is you, Jedediah. And you just lost." Croft saw the look in the sheriff's eyes and knew his life was over. He turned and ran, scrambling up the side of the canyon in a desperate bid for escape. Briggs raised his pistol and fired once. The shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, flat crack that sent a flock of crows scattering into the sky. Jedediah Croft tumbled down the rocky slope and lay still. Briggs holstered his pistol, his expression grim. He turned to the stunned deputies and onlookers. "He was a traitor," Briggs announced, his voice ringing with authority. "He was stealing from the mine, running guns, and he was responsible for the death of Sheriff Harper. I just administered the justice he deserved." He had, in one stroke, eliminated his traitorous partner, solidified his reputation as a decisive man of action, and unwittingly closed the book on Daniel's murder. From a high ridge overlooking the canyon, hidden in a thicket of pines, Eloise watched the entire scene unfold through a small spyglass. She saw the confrontation, the desperate plea, the final, fatal shot. She lowered the spyglass, her face devoid of expression. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only a cold, empty sense of completion. Cole Hargrove had been driven into the wilderness by his own demons. Jedediah Croft had been executed by the very man he had conspired with. Two more names were crossed off her list. She had turned their own greed and paranoia against them, making them the instruments of their own destruction. As she rode silently back towards town, she knew that Roland Briggs, feeling secure in his power once again, would be more dangerous than ever. But he was also more isolated. She had begun to cut the legs out from under his throne, and soon, all that would be left was the king himself. The death of Jedediah Croft, publicly framed as the act of a heroic sheriff bringing a traitor to justice, sent a tremor of fear through Redemption Gulch. Roland Briggs had intended it as a demonstration of his absolute authority, a warning that disloyalty would be met with swift and lethal force. But the move had an unintended consequence. It made him seem volatile and unpredictable. His remaining allies, the petty criminals and corrupt officials who made up his network, began to look at him with a new wariness. He had killed one of his own inner circle on the strength of a ledger entry and a convenient rockslide. Who was to say who might be next? Briggs, blind to this undercurrent of fear, believed he had consolidated his power. He had a plausible story for Daniel Harper's murder, a dead scapegoat in Croft, and had eliminated a partner he was growing tired of sharing profits with. He believed the slate was clean. He failed to see that the foundation of his empire was cracking, that the quiet, systematic removal of its key pillars was not an act of chance, but of design. Eloise, meanwhile, retreated deeper into her widow's weeds. With Cole, Miller, and Croft all gone, the town was rife with speculation, but none of it ever pointed in her direction. She was a tragic figure, the blameless victim of the town's violent underbelly. Her fragility was her armor. But beneath the calm exterior, a quiet war was being waged within her own soul. Killing Miller with poison had been a cold, detached act. Driving Cole to madness had been a cruel but necessary piece of psychological warfare. Orchestrating Croft's death at the hands of Briggs had been a masterstroke of manipulation. But the cumulative effect was taking its toll. She would catch her reflection in a windowpane and, for a moment, not recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now shadowed, her expression guarded and hard. She was becoming a creature of the night, a weaver of death, and she feared she was losing the last vestiges of the woman Daniel had loved. Was this justice, or was it simply a more patient, more intelligent form of the same brutality her husband had fought against? The line had become terrifyingly blurred. Her internal struggle was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. One evening, as dusk was settling, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Sadie Quinn. The saloon owner stood on her porch, not with a look of pity, but with an expression of intense, unnerving focus. "Mrs. Harper," Sadie said, her voice low. "May I come in?" Eloise hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was a dangerous deviation from the script. But to refuse would be more suspicious than to acquiesce. "Of course, Miss Quinn," she said, her voice the perfect blend of surprise and politeness. She led Sadie into the parlor. The house was immaculately clean, a shrine to a lost domestic peace. A portrait of Daniel, smiling and handsome in his sheriff's uniform, sat on the mantelpiece. Sadie didn't sit. She walked around the small room, her eyes taking in every detail. She stopped in front of the portrait. "He was a good man," she said. It wasn't a platitude, it was a statement of fact. "Yes, he was," Eloise replied softly. Sadie turned to face her, her gaze direct and unflinching. "A lot of bad luck has been going around since he died," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp as glass. Miller's heart gave out. Cole Hargrove just up and vanished. And now Croft gets himself shot by the sheriff. A man might think this town is cursed. "It's a hard land, Miss Quinn," Eloise said, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "It's not the land I'm talking about," Sadie countered. She took a step closer. "I'm a businesswoman, Mrs. Harper. I deal in facts, not feelings. Fact, Miller dies of a heart attack after you give me a book to give to him. Fact, Cole Hargrove, a man drowning in guilt, disappears after a series of, let's call them unfortunate coincidences that all seem to point back to his dead friend. Fact, Jedediah Croft is executed by his partner based on evidence that appears out of thin air right after you, the grieving widow, pay a visit to his office to settle an account. Sadie paused, letting the weight of her words fill the silent room. You are either the unluckiest woman in the entire territory, or you are the single most brilliant and dangerous person I have ever met. And I, for one, do not believe in that much bad luck. Eloise did not flinch. She met Sadie's gaze, her own eyes a placid and readable pool. The mask of the fragile widow was still in place, but for the first time, Sadie could see the steel beneath it. I don't know what you're implying, Miss Quinn, Eloise said, her voice steady. Oh, I think you do, Sadie said, a slow, grudging smile touching her lips. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not the law. And God knows, I have no love for Briggs or his cronies. They're bad for business. They're bad for the town. They killed a good man, and they thought they'd get away with it. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm here because I want to know what happens next. Because a storm is coming for Roland Briggs, and I've just realized that you are the one holding the lightning. It was a gambit, a declaration of alliance from the most unlikely of sources. Sadie was the queen of Redemption Gulch's underworld, a survivor who knew how to play the odds. And she had just placed her bet on the quiet woman in black. Eloise looked at the shrewd, pragmatic woman before her. For weeks, she had been utterly alone in her quest. The isolation had been a necessary burden, but a heavy one. In Sadie's eyes, she saw not an accuser, but a potential ally, a fellow traveler in the gray borderlands between law and justice. She did not admit anything. She did not have to. She simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an answer, an acceptance, a silent partnership forged in the parlor of a dead man. Briggs is getting nervous, Sadie continued, accepting the silent answer. He's hired a new gun. A man named Reno. A killer with a nasty reputation. He's keeping him quiet, using him for muscle. Briggs trusts no one now. He's a snake eating its own tail. The information was a gift, a piece of the puzzle Eloise did not have. A new player was on the board. Her work was not yet done. As Sadie left, she paused at the door. Be careful, Eloise, she said, using her first name for the first time. The most dangerous time for a hunter is when the prey knows it's being cornered. The warning hung in the air long after she was gone. Eloise knew she was right. She had been the invisible hand of fate. But now, someone else saw her. And soon, the cornered beast, Sheriff Roland Briggs, would finally turn and see the face of his hunter. The arrival of a man like Reno in a town like Redemption Gulch was usually a loud affair. Men of his reputation hired guns whose past was a collection of wanted posters, and whose future was a shallow grave intended to announce their presence with a swagger and a challenge. But Reno was different. He slipped into town and noticed a lean, wolfish man with dead eyes and a silence about him that was more menacing than any boast. He was Roland Briggs's secret weapon, a scalpel to be used when a hammer was too clumsy. Briggs kept him on a short leash, housed in a back room of the jailhouse, away from the prying eyes of the Golden Spur. Reno's job was simple, to be the sheriff's shadow, to observe, and to eliminate any new threats that might arise. Briggs, deeply unsettled by the bad luck that had plagued his enterprise, was no longer just looking for external enemies. He was looking for the rot within, the whisper of betrayal that had brought down Croft. He trusted no one, and Reno was the embodiment of that trustlessness, a man loyal only to the coin. Eloise, armed with Sadie's warning, knew she had to adapt her strategy. Direct manipulation or staged accidents would be too risky with a professional killer watching from the shadows. She needed to draw Reno out, to understand him, and to use his own skills against him. She also knew that her next and final target was Briggs himself. To get to the king, she had to first remove his deadliest knight. Her opportunity came from an unexpected source, the surrendering Red Hawk rider from Jack Malone's ranch, who had been languishing in Briggs's jail for weeks. Briggs had kept him alive as a trophy, a symbol of his control. The prisoner, a young man named Billy, was terrified and desperate. Eloise saw him as a key. Through Sadie, who had a network of eyes and ears that extended even into the jailhouse, Outlaws began a subtle campaign of communication. A sympathetic stable boy who brought food to the prisoners would accidentally drop a newspaper. Tucked within its pages was a small, coded message. It didn't offer escape, it offered a deal. Outlaws, posing as an agent of a rival outfit looking to move in on Briggs's territory, offered Billy a full pardon and a pouch of gold in exchange for one simple service: information. Billy, with nothing to lose and facing the prospect of a hangman's noose, eagerly agreed. He began to observe. He listened to the conversations between Briggs and Reno. He watched their routines, their habits. He became Eloise's spy inside the lion's den. Through Billy, Eloise learned Reno's weakness. He wasn't a drinker or a gambler. He was a professional, but he had one small vanity, a fascination with rare and high-quality firearms. He spent his off hours meticulously cleaning and oiling his own custom-made Schofield revolver, and he was known to have paid exorbitant sums for unique weapons. This was the crack in his armor. Eloise, through a contact of Sadie's in a larger city, arranged for a rumor to be spread. The rumor spoke of a legendary gunsmith, recently deceased, whose masterpiece, a rare Evans repeating rifle with custom silver inlay, was being quietly offered for sale by his widow. The supposed location of this widow, a small, isolated ranch a day's ride north of Redemption Gulch. The rumor was carefully constructed to appeal directly to Reno's specific obsession. As expected, the rumor eventually reached Reno's ears. His professional caution warred with his collector's greed. A weapon like that was a prize, a legend. Briggs, consumed by his own paranoia, refused to let Reno leave town to investigate. This only fueled Reno's desire, making the prize seem even more exclusive and valuable. Eloise then moved to the next phase of her plan. She needed to create a crisis, a distraction that would force Briggs to send Reno out of town. She used another piece of information from her spy, Billy. A large shipment of cash, the mining company's payroll, was being held in the sheriff's safe, waiting for an armed escort to the main office. It was a tempting target. She didn't plan a robbery. She planned the appearance of a robbery. She again used her anonymous agent persona, sending a message to the last few semi-organized outlaws in the territory, men who were too small time for Briggs to have bothered eliminating. She leaked the information about the payroll, hinting that a rival was going to hit the sheriff's office in tonight's time, and that any gang who showed up could claim a piece of the action. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection. She was using the dregs of the territory's outlaws as a disposable army. As predicted, 2 nights later, a desperate, ragtag group of bandits rode into Redemption Gulch, guns blazing, intent on robbing the sheriff's office. The town erupted in gunfire. Briggs, caught completely by surprise, was forced into a desperate firefight. It was exactly the chaos Eloise needed. In the midst of the gun battle, with Briggs and his deputies pinned down, she made her move. She didn't go near the jail. She went to the telegraph office. The telegraph operator, a nervous man named Peters, was cowering under his desk. Eloise, a dark, calm figure in the midst of the panic, entered the office. "Get up, Mr. Peters," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed a small, but very real, derringer on his desk. "You need to send a message." She dictated a short telegram to the regional army headquarters. The message, sent under Sheriff Briggs's name, was a frantic, desperate plea for help, reporting that the town was under siege by a massive, well-organized gang and that the sheriff's office was about to be overrun. She knew the army would take hours, if not a day, to respond, but that wasn't the point. The point was the official record. Back at the jail, Briggs was finally getting the upper hand on the amateurish outlaws. But he was furious, convinced that this was a direct assault by the same phantom force that had been tormenting him. His paranoia peaked. He saw enemies in every shadow. The next morning, with the mess of the failed robbery cleaned up, Reno came to him, more insistent than ever. "This is a diversion," Reno argued. "They're testing your defenses. While you're fighting off these small fry, the real players are making their move. The rumor about that rifle, it's connected. It's a trap, or it's a payment for someone. I need to go check it out. I need to see who's pulling the strings." Briggs, his judgment clouded by fear and rage, finally agreed. The idea that the rifle was a key to a larger conspiracy made sense to his paranoid mind. "Fine," he snarled. "Go. Find out who it is. And when you do, kill them. Reno rode out that afternoon, heading north. He was not riding towards a legendary rifle. He was riding into a meticulously prepared ambush. Eloise had chosen the location with care, a stretch of trail that passed through a narrow pass, with high, rocky walls on either side. It was a natural kill box. She was waiting for him, not with a rifle in a sniper's nest, but with a simple, brutal trap. She had spent the previous day hauling a heavy, rotted log to the top of the pass and securing it with a single, thick rope. The other end of the rope was tied to a trigger she had fashioned across the trail, almost invisible in the dust. Reno, the professional, the man who prided himself on his awareness, was so focused on the prize that awaited him that he made a fatal mistake. He let his greed override his caution. As his horse tripped the rope, the heavy log was released from above. It didn't fall on him. It fell directly in front of his horse. The animal screamed in terror, rearing violently and throwing Reno from the saddle. He landed hard, his head striking a rock. He was stunned, dazed, the world a spinning, blurry mess. Before he could recover, before he could even reach for his famous Schofield, a shadow fell over him. He looked up into the calm, cold eyes of the woman in black, the grieving widow he had dismissed as nothing more than a piece of the town's scenery. A look of pure, unadulterated shock crossed his face. "You," he whispered, the single word a question, an accusation, and an epitaph. Eloise didn't answer. She raised the heavy rock she was holding and brought it down with a singular, brutal finality. The hired gun's mistake was his last. She had removed the final piece from the board, leaving the king exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. The discovery of Reno's body a day later sent the final shockwave through Roland Briggs's crumbling psyche. The official story, cobbled together by the deputies who found him, was that he had been thrown from his horse in a tragic accident. His head had struck a rock. It was plausible, simple, and utterly wrong. Briggs knew it was no accident. He stood in the quiet of his office, the jailhouse eerily silent without Reno's menacing presence, and stared at the map on his wall. One by one, his assets had been stripped away. Miller, the fool. Cole, the ghost. Croft, the traitor. And now Reno, the professional. They hadn't just died. They had been systematically, intelligently, and invisibly eliminated. This wasn't a rival gang. A gang was loud, messy, and motivated by profit. This was something else. This was personal. It was an extermination. His paranoia, once a simmering fire, now raged into a consuming inferno. He saw assassins in the faces of the townsfolk, betrayal in the eyes of his own deputies. He barricaded himself in his office, drinking heavily, the bottle of whiskey his only trusted confidant. His mind raced, replaying every event since Daniel Harper's death, searching for a pattern, a face, a name he had overlooked. Who hated him this much? Who was smart enough, patient enough, to orchestrate such a campaign? He thought of the ranchers he'd squeezed, the businessmen he'd blackmailed. Any one of them had a motive, but did any have the means? The skill? It didn't fit. The attacks were too precise, too elegant in their cruelty. And then, a small, insignificant memory floated to the surface. It was from weeks ago, the day he had killed Croft in the canyon. He remembered Croft's final, desperate plea. "It's a setup. Someone is playing us." Briggs had dismissed it as the ravings of a guilty man. But what if he was right? He stormed over to the evidence locker and pulled out the forged ledger. He stared at the handwriting, the perfect, meticulous script that had condemned Croft to death. He had assumed it was Croft's, but now he looked closer. There was something about it. A slight, almost imperceptible flair to the letters, a grace that seemed feminine. The thought was so absurd he almost laughed it off. A woman? Impossible. But the seed was planted. He started thinking. The book given to Miller. The whispers that had driven Cole mad. The visit to Croft's office. Who was the one common element, the one person who had been present at the periphery of every single incident, a mournful, black-clad ghost that no one ever paid any real attention to? The widow Harper. The name hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back, sinking into his chair, the ledger falling from his numb fingers. It couldn't be. The fragile, broken woman who had leaned on his arm at the funeral. The soft-spoken, timid creature who flinched at loud noises. But the more he thought about it, the more the impossible began to seem terrifyingly plausible. Her grief wasn't a weakness, it was the perfect camouflage. Her quietness wasn't sorrow, it was surveillance. She had been hiding in plain sight, using their pity and condescension as her shield. Daniel Harper hadn't just been a good sheriff, he had been a smart one. And he had obviously taught his wife more than just how to keep a home. He thought of her face, the pale, serene mask of sorrow. And for the first time, he saw not a victim, but an avenger of terrifying resolve. He, Roland Briggs, the man who controlled a whole territory, had been systematically dismantled by a woman he wouldn't have trusted to carry his groceries. The humiliation was as sharp as any bullet. His fear curdled into a final, explosive rage. He had been played, outmaneuvered at every turn. But the game wasn't over. He was still the sheriff. He still had the badge, the gun, and the law on his side. There would be no more subtlety. No more ghosts. He would go to her house, confront her, and end this, once and for all. He would wipe that serene, mocking expression off her face and put her in the ground next to her husband. As he strapped on his gun belt, a rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The sky outside was darkening, the air growing heavy and thick with the promise of a storm. It was a fitting atmosphere for the final act. The king, stripped of his knights and his pawns, was leaving his castle of dust to confront the queen who had checkmated him from across the board. He thought he was the hunter, finally cornering his prey. He had no idea he was walking into the last, most personal trap of all. The storm broke over Redemption Gulch with a biblical fury. Rain came down in solid, gray sheets, turning the dusty streets into rivers of mud. Lightning bleached the sky white, followed by concussive blasts of thunder that shook the flimsy buildings to their foundations. It was a night for ghosts and reckonings, a night that washed the world clean while revealing the dirt underneath. Roland Briggs, soaked to the skin within seconds of leaving his office, stalked through the deluge towards Eloise Harper's house. The whiskey he had consumed did little to warm him, it only fueled the cold, hard knot of rage in his gut. He was a man walking to his own destiny, oblivious to the fact that his opponent had written the final chapter. He didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door open, the wood splintering from the frame, and stormed into the small, neat house. He stood dripping in the entryway, his pistol drawn, his eyes wild. "Eloise," he roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. The parlor was lit by a single, steady burning lantern on the mantelpiece. And there she was. She wasn't cowering in a corner or hiding in the shadows. She was sitting calmly in an armchair facing the door, as if she had been expecting him. She was not wearing her widow's black. She was dressed in a simple, practical dress of dark blue. In her lap, resting on her folded hands, was Daniel's cold peacemaker. The sight of her, so calm, so prepared, momentarily stripped the rage from him, leaving behind a sliver of pure, cold fear. The prey was not cornered. The prey had set the trap. "Hello, Roland," she said, her voice even and clear, devoid of the soft, sorrowful whisper he was used to. It was the voice of a stranger. "It was you," he breathed, words both an accusation and a confirmation of his worst fears. "All of it. Miller, Cole, Croft, Reno. You did all of it." "They betrayed my husband," she replied, her voice unwavering. "They were judged." "Judged?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're not a judge. You're a murderer. A woman playing a man's game. Is that what this is, Roland? A man's game?" She finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the full, unbridled force of the woman he had so fatally underestimated. Her eyes were not the eyes of a fragile widow. They were the eyes of a survivor, a warrior, ancient and weary and utterly without mercy. "Daniel played by the rules of men," she continued. "He believed in the law, in honor, and a friend's loyalty. Look where it got him. I am playing a different game. My game. And in my game, the guilty do not get a trial. They get a consequence." He raised his pistol, the barrel shaking slightly. "This game is over, Eloise. I'm putting you in the ground." "Are you?" she asked. And then she moved. She didn't lunge or scream. With a fluid grace that defied belief, she leaned to the side of the armchair as a deafening shotgun blast erupted from the darkened kitchen behind her. The blast tore through the back of the armchair where she had been sitting moments before, a cloud of horsehair and splinters exploding into the room. Briggs cried out, not in pain, but in sheer shock. His attention, his entire world, had been focused on her. He never saw the second player. Sadie Quinn stepped out of the kitchen, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in her hands, smoke curling from one of its barrels. Her face was grim, her eyes hard. "The house always wins, Sheriff," Sadie said, her voice flat. Briggs, his nerve finally breaking, spun back towards Eloise. She had risen to her feet, Daniel's Colt now in her hand, leveled at his heart. He was caught between them, checkmated. For the first time that night, Eloise felt a tremor run through her body. It wasn't fear. It was the crushing weight of finality. This was the last name on her list, the source of all her pain. Killing him would end it. The storm of her rage, the long, cold winter of her grief, would finally be over. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the man in front of her. Tears for Daniel, for the woman she had been, and for the killer she had become. "You took everything from me," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she had suppressed for months. Seeing her tears, her trembling hand, Briggs saw a flicker of hope. He saw the fragile woman he thought he knew. "You can't do it, Eloise," he sneered, "a fatal miscalculation. You don't have the stomach for it." His words, meant to unnerve her, had the opposite effect. They burned away the tears, solidified the tremor into a rock-steady calm. He was right. The woman she had been couldn't do it. But that woman was long dead. She fired. The sound of the Colt was a sharp, definitive crack that seemed to silence the storm outside for a single heartbeat. Roland Briggs staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest, then back up at Eloise. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward onto the floor, his reign over Redemption Gulch ending in a pool of his own blood on a dead man's parlor floor. Silence descended, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Eloise stood over the body, the heavy gun still in her hand, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Her long, dark quest was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. But as she looked at the man she had just killed, she felt no triumph, no peace. Only a vast, hollow emptiness. Sadie came and gently took the gun from her hand. "It's over, Eloise," she said softly. Eloise looked at her friend, her ally, and then around the small house that had been her sanctuary and her war room. The storm outside was beginning to subside, the rain lessening to a gentle patter. A new day was coming. She had no idea what it would hold for her, or who she was now that the vengeance that had defined her was complete. She had won. She had reclaimed her husband's honor. But in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the ghosts of her own making, she had to face the most difficult question of all: what is the cost of justice? And who is left to pay the price when the debts are all settled?